Vladimir Lenin's left-wing communism, an infantile disorder. The struggle against which enemies within the working class movement helped Bolshevism develop, gain strength, and become steeled. First and foremost, the struggle against opportunism, which in 1914 definitely developed into social chauvinism and definitely sided with the bourgeoisie, against the proletariat. Naturally, this was Bolshevism's principal enemy within the working class movement. It still remains the principal enemy on an international scale. The Bolsheviks have been devoting the greatest attention to this enemy. This aspect of Bolshevik activities is now fairly well known abroad too. It was, however, different with Bolshevism's other enemy within the working class movement. Little is known in other countries of the fact that Bolshevism took shape, developed and became steeled in the long years of struggle against petty bourgeois revolutionism, which smacks of anarchism, or borrows something from the latter and, in all essential matters, does not measure up to the conditions and requirements of a consistently proletarian class struggle. Marxist theory has established, and the experience of all European revolutions and revolutionary movements has fully confirmed, that the petty proprietor, the small master, a social type existing on a very extensive and even mass scale in many European countries, who, under capitalism, always suffers oppression and very frequently a most acute and rapid deterioration in his conditions of life, and even ruin, easily goes to revolutionary extremes, but is incapable of perseverance, organization, discipline and steadfastness. A petty bourgeois driven to frenzy by the horrors of capitalism is a social phenomenon which, like anarchism, is characteristic of all capitalist countries. The instability of such revolutionism, its barrenness, and its tendency to turn rapidly into submission, apathy, phantasms, and even a frenzied infatuation with one bourgeois fad or another, all this is common knowledge. However, a theoretical or abstract recognition of these truths does not at all rid revolutionary parties of old errors, which always crop up at unexpected occasions, in somewhat new forms, in a hitherto unfamiliar garb or surroundings, in an unusual, a more or less unusual, situation. Anarchism was not infrequently a kind of penalty for the opportunist sins of the working class movement. The two monstrosities complemented each other. And if in Russia, despite the more petty bourgeois composition of her population as compared with the other European countries, anarchism's influence was negligible during the two revolutions, of 1905 and 1917, and the preparations for them, this should no doubt stand partly to the credit of Bolshevism, which has always waged a most truthless and uncompromising struggle against opportunism. I say partly, since of still greater importance in weakening anarchism's influence in Russia was the circumstance that in the past, the 70s of the 19th century, it was able to develop inordinately and to reveal its absolute erroneousness, its unfitness to serve the revolutionary class as a guiding theory. When it came into being in 1903, Bolshevism took over the tradition of a ruthless struggle against petty bourgeois, semi-anarchist, or dilettante anarchist, revolutionism, a tradition which had always existed in revolutionary social democracy and had become particularly strong in our country during the years 1900 to 03, when the foundations for a mass party of the revolutionary proletariat were being laid in Russia. Bolshevism took over and carried on the struggle against a party which, more than any other, expressed the tendencies of petty bourgeois revolutionism, namely, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and waged that struggle on three main issues. First, that party, which rejected Marxism, stubbornly refused, or, it might be more correct to say, was unable, to understand the need for a strictly objective appraisal of the class forces and their alignment, before taking any political action. Second, this party considered itself particularly revolutionary, or left, because of its recognition of individual terrorism, assassination, something that we Marxists emphatically rejected. It was, of course, only on grounds of expediency that we rejected individual terrorism, whereas people who were capable of condemning on principle the terror of the Great French Revolution, or, in general, the terror employed by a victorious revolutionary party which is besieged by the bourgeoisie of the whole world, were ridiculed and laughed to scorn by Plekhanov in 1903, when he was a Marxist and a revolutionary. Third, the socialist revolutionaries thought it very left to sneer at the comparatively insignificant opportunist sins of the German Social Democratic Party, while they themselves imitated the extreme opportunists of that party, for example, on the agrarian question, or on the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. History, incidentally, has now confirmed on a vast and worldwide scale the opinion we have always advocated, namely, that German revolutionary social democracy. Note that as far back as 1900-03 Plekhanov demanded Bernstein's expulsion from the party, and in 1913 the Bolsheviks, always continuing this tradition, exposed legions, baseness, vileness and treachery, came closest to being the party the revolutionary proletariat needs in order to achieve victory. Today, in 1920, after all the ignominious failures and crises of the war period and the early post-war years, it can be plainly seen that, of all the Western parties, the German Revolutionary Social Democrats produced the finest leaders, and recovered and gained new strength more rapidly than the others did. This may be seen in the instances both of the Spartacists, 11, and the left, proletarian wing of the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, which is waging an incessant struggle against the opportunism and spinelessness of the Kotskys, Hilferdings, Ledebers, and Crispians. If we now cast a glance to take in a complete historical period, namely, from the Paris Commune to the First Socialist Soviet Republic, we shall find that Marxism's attitude to anarchism in general stands out most definitely and unmistakably. In the final analysis, Marxism proved to be correct, and although the anarchists rightly pointed to the opportunist views on the state prevalent among most of the socialist parties, it must be said, first, that this opportunism was connected with the distortion, and even deliberate suppression, of Marx's views on the state. In my book, The State and Revolution, I pointed out that for 36 years, from 1875 to 1911, Bebel withheld a letter by Engels, 12, which very clearly, vividly, bluntly and definitively exposed the opportunism of the current social democratic views on the state. Second, that the rectification of these opportunist views, and the recognition of Soviet power and its superiority to bourgeois parliamentary democracy proceeded most rapidly and extensively among those trends in the socialist parties of Europe and America that were most Marxist. The struggle that Bolshevism waged against left deviations within its own party assumed particularly large proportions on two occasions, in 1908. On the question of whether or not to participate in a most reactionary parliament and in the legal workers' societies, which were being restricted by most reactionary laws, and again in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 13, on the question of whether one compromise or another was permissible. In 1908 the left Bolsheviks were expelled from our party for stubbornly refusing to understand the necessity of participating in a most reactionary parliament. 14. The lefts, among whom there were many splendid revolutionaries who subsequently were, and still are, commendable members of the Communist Party, based themselves particularly on the successful experience of the 1905 boycott. When, in August 1905, the Tsar proclaimed the convocation of a consultative parliament, 15, the Bolsheviks called for its boycott, in the teeth of all the opposition parties and the Mensheviks, and the parliament was in fact swept away by the Revolution of October 1905. 16. The boycott proved correct at the time, not because non-participation in reactionary parliaments is correct in general, but because we accurately appraised the objective situation, which was leading to the rapid development of the mass strikes, first into a political strike, then into a revolutionary strike, and finally into an uprising. Moreover, the struggle centered at that time on the question of whether the convocation of the first representative assembly should be left to the Tsar, or an attempt should be made to wrest its convocation from the old regime. When there was not, and could not be, any certainty that the objective situation was of a similar kind, and when there was no certainty of a similar trend and the same rate of development, the boycott was no longer correct. The Bolsheviks' boycott of parliament in 1905 enriched the revolutionary proletariat with highly valuable political experience and showed that, when legal and illegal parliamentary and non-parliamentary forms of struggle are combined, it is sometimes useful and even essential to reject parliamentary forms. It would, however, be highly erroneous to apply this experience blindly, imitatively and uncritically to other conditions and other situations. The Bolsheviks' boycott of the Duma in 1906 was a mistake, although a minor and easily remediable one. The boycott of the Duma in 1907, 1908 and subsequent years was a most serious error and difficult to remedy, because, on the one hand, a very rapid rise of the revolutionary tide and its conversion into an uprising was not to be expected, and, on the other hand, the entire historical situation attendant upon the renovation of the bourgeois monarchy called for legal and illegal activities being combined. Today, when we look back at this fully completed historical period, whose connection with subsequent periods has now become quite clear, it becomes most obvious that in 1908–14 the Bolsheviks could not have preserved, let alone strengthened and developed, the core of the revolutionary party of the proletariat, had they not upheld, in a most strenuous struggle, the viewpoint that it was obligatory to combine legal and illegal forms of struggle, and that it was obligatory to participate even in a most reactionary parliament and in a number of other institutions hemmed in by reactionary laws, sick benefit societies, etc. In 1918 things did not reach a split. At that time the left communists formed only a separate group or faction within our party, and that not for long. In the same year, 1918, the most prominent representatives of left communism, for example, comrades Radek and Bukharin, openly acknowledged their error. It had seemed to them that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a compromise with the imperialists, which was inexcusable on principle and harmful to the party of the revolutionary proletariat. It was indeed a compromise with the imperialists, but it was a compromise which, under the circumstances, had to be made. Today, when I hear our tactics in signing the Brest-Litovsk Treaty being attacked by the socialist revolutionaries, for instance, or when I hear Comrade Lansbury say, in a conversation with me, our British trade union leaders say that if it was permissible for the Bolsheviks to compromise, it is permissible for them to compromise too, I usually reply by first of all giving a simple and popular example. Imagine that your car is held up by armed bandits. You hand them over your money, passport, revolver and car. In return you are rid of the pleasant company of the bandits. That is unquestionably a compromise. Do a day, I give you money, firearms and a car so that you give me the opportunity to get away from you with a whole skin. It would, however, be difficult to find a sane man who would declare such a compromise to be inadmissible on principle, or who would call the compromiser an accomplice of the bandits, even though the bandits might use the car and the firearms for further robberies. Our compromise with the bandits of German imperialism was just that kind of compromise. But when, in 1914–18 and then in 1918–20, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries in Russia, the Siedmanites, and to a large extent the Trotskyites, in Germany, Otto Bauer and Friedrich Adler, to say nothing of the Renners and Co., in Austria, the Renaudels and Lungetz and Company in France, the Fabians, the Independents and the Leibrights in Britain entered into compromises with the bandits of their own bourgeoisie, and sometimes of the Allied bourgeoisie, and against the revolutionary proletariat of their own countries. All these gentlemen were actually acting as accomplices in banditry. The conclusion is clear: to reject compromises on principle, to reject the permissibility of compromises in general, no matter of what kind, is childishness, which it is difficult even to consider seriously. A political leader who desires to be useful to the revolutionary proletariat must be able to distinguish concrete cases of compromises that are inexcusable and are an expression of opportunism and treachery. He must direct all the force of criticism, the full intensity of merciless exposure and relentless war, against these concrete compromises, and not allow the past masters of practical socialism and the parliamentary Jesuits to dodge and wriggle out of responsibility by means of disquisitions on compromises in general. It is in this way that the leaders of the British trade unions, as well as of the Fabian Society and the Independent Labour Party, dodge responsibility for the treachery they have perpetrated, for having made a compromise that is really tantamount to the worst kind of opportunism, treachery and betrayal. There are different kinds of compromises. One must be able to analyze the situation and the concrete conditions of each compromise, or of each variety of compromise. One must learn to distinguish between a man who has given up his money and firearms to bandits so as to lessen the evil they can do and to facilitate their capture and execution, and a man who gives his money and firearms to bandits so as to share in the loot. In politics this is by no means always as elementary as it is in this childishly simple example. However, anyone who is out to think up for the workers some kind of recipe that will provide them with cut and dried solutions for all contingencies, or promises that the policy of the revolutionary proletariat will never come up against difficult or complex situations, is simply a charlatan. To leave no room for misinterpretation, I shall attempt to outline, if only very briefly, several fundamental rules for the analysis of concrete compromises. The party which entered into a compromise with the German imperialists by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had been evolving its internationalism in practice ever since the end of 1914. It was not afraid to call for the defeat of the Tsarist monarchy and to condemn defense of country in a war between two imperialist robbers. The parliamentary representatives of this party preferred exile in Siberia to taking a road leading to ministerial portfolios in a bourgeois government. The revolution that overthrew Tsarism and established a democratic republic put this party to a new and tremendous test. It did not enter into any agreements with its own imperialists, but prepared and brought about their overthrow. When it had assumed political power, this party did not leave a vestige of either landed or capitalist ownership. After making public and repudiating the imperialists' secret treaties, this party proposed peace to all nations, and yielded to the violence of the Brest-Litovsk robbers only after the Anglo-French imperialists had torpedoed the conclusion of a peace, and after the Bolsheviks had done everything humanly possible to hasten the revolution in Germany and other countries. The absolute correctness of this compromise, entered into by such a party in such a situation, is becoming ever clearer and more obvious with every day. The Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries in Russia, like all the leaders of the Second International throughout the world, in 1914–20, began with treachery, by directly or indirectly justifying defense of country, that is, the defense of their own predatory bourgeoisie. They continued their treachery by entering into a coalition with the bourgeoisie of their own country, and fighting, together with their own bourgeoisie, against the revolutionary proletariat of their own country. Their bloc, first with Kerensky and the cadets, and then with Kolchak and Denikin in Russia, like the bloc of their confreres abroad with the bourgeoisie of their respective countries, was in fact desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie, against the proletariat. From beginning to end, their compromise with the bandits of imperialism meant their becoming accomplices in imperialist banditry, left-wing communism in Germany. The leaders, the party, the class, the masses. The German communists we must now speak of call themselves, not left-wingers but, if I am not mistaken, an opposition on principle. 17. From what follows below it will, however, be seen that they reveal all the symptoms of the infantile disorder of leftism. Published by the local group in Frankfurt am Main, a pamphlet reflecting the point of view of this opposition, and entitled The Split in the Communist Party of Germany, the Spartacus League, sets forth the substance of this opposition's views most saliently, and with the utmost clarity and concision. A few quotations will suffice to acquaint the reader with that substance. The Communist Party is the party of the most determined class struggle. Politically, the transitional period, between capitalism and socialism, is one of the proletarian dictatorship. The question arises, who is to exercise this dictatorship, the Communist Party or the proletarian class? Fundamentally, should we strive for a dictatorship of the Communist Party, or for a dictatorship of the proletarian class? All italics as in the original. The author of the pamphlet goes on to accuse the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Germany of seeking ways of achieving a coalition with the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, and of raising the question of recognizing, in principle, all political means of struggle, including parliamentarianism, with the sole purpose of concealing its actual and main efforts to form a coalition with the independents. The pamphlet goes on to say, "The opposition have chosen another road. They are of the opinion that the question of the rule of the Communist Party and of the dictatorship of the party is merely one of tactics. In any case, rule by the Communist Party is the ultimate form of any party rule. Fundamentally, we must work for the dictatorship of the proletarian class. And all the measures of the party, its organizations, methods of struggle, strategy and tactics should be directed to that end. Accordingly, all compromise with other parties, all reversion to parliamentary forms of struggle which have become historically and politically obsolete, and any policy of maneuvering and compromise must be emphatically rejected. Specifically, proletarian methods of revolutionary struggle must be strongly emphasized. New forms of organization must be created on the widest basis and with the widest scope in order to enlist the most extensive proletarian circles and strain to take part in the revolutionary struggle under the leadership of the Communist Party. A workers' union, based on factory organizations, should be the rallying point for all revolutionary elements. This should unite all workers who follow the slogan, 'Get out of the trade unions.' It is here that the militant proletariat musters its ranks for battle. Recognition of the class struggle, of the Soviet system and of the dictatorship should be sufficient for enrollment. All subsequent political education of the fighting masses and their political orientation in the struggle are the task of the Communist Party, which stands outside the workers' union. Consequently, two communist parties are now arrayed against each other. One is a party of leaders, which is out to organize the revolutionary struggle and to direct it from above, accepting compromises and parliamentarianism so as to create a situation enabling it to join a coalition government exercising a dictatorship. The other is a mass party, which expects an upsurge of the revolutionary struggle from below, which knows and applies a single method in this struggle, a method which clearly leads to the goal, and rejects all parliamentary and opportunist methods. That single method is the unconditional overthrow of the bourgeoisie, so as then to set up the proletarian class dictatorship for the accomplishment of socialism. There, the dictatorship of leaders; here, the dictatorship of the masses. That is our slogan. Such are the main features characterizing the views of the opposition in the German Communist Party. Any Bolshevik who has consciously participated in the development of Bolshevism since 1903 or has closely observed that development will at once say, after reading these arguments, what old and familiar rubbish! What left-wing childishness! But let us examine these arguments a little more closely. The mere presentation of the question, dictatorship of the party or dictatorship of the class, dictatorship, party, of the leaders, or dictatorship, party, of the masses, testifies to most incredibly and hopelessly muddled thinking. These people want to invent something quite out of the ordinary, and, in their effort to be clever, make themselves ridiculous. It is common knowledge that the masses are divided into classes, that the masses can be contrasted with classes only by contrasting the vast majority in general, regardless of division according to status in the social system of production, with categories holding a definite status in the social system of production, that as a rule and in most cases, at least in present-day civilized countries, classes are led by political parties, that political parties, as a general rule, are run by more or less stable groups composed of the most authoritative, influential and experienced members, who are elected to the most responsible positions, and are called leaders. All this is elementary. All this is clear and simple. Why replace this with some kind of rigmarole, some new volapük? On the one hand, these people seem to have got muddled when they found themselves in a predicament, when the party's abrupt transition from legality to illegality upset the customary, normal and simple relations between leaders, parties and classes. In Germany, as in other European countries, People had become too accustomed to legality, to the free and proper election of leaders at regular party congresses, to the convenient method of testing the class composition of parties through parliamentary elections, mass meetings, the press, the sentiments of the trade unions and other associations, etc. When, instead of this customary procedure, it became necessary, because of the stormy development of the revolution and the development of the Civil War, to go over rapidly from legality to illegality, to combine the two, and to adopt the inconvenient and undemocratic methods of selecting, or forming, or preserving groups of leaders, people lost their bearings and began to think up some unmitigated nonsense. Certain members of the Communist Party of Holland, who were unlucky enough to be born in a small country with traditions and conditions of highly privileged and highly stable legality, and who had never seen a transition from legality to illegality, probably fell into confusion, lost their heads, and helped create these absurd inventions. On the other hand, one can see simply a thoughtless and incoherent use of the now fashionable terms, masses and leaders. These people have heard and memorized a great many attacks on leaders, in which the latter have been contrasted with the masses. However, they have proved unable to think matters out and gain a clear understanding of what it was all about. The divergence between leaders and masses was brought out with particular clarity and sharpness in all countries at the end of the imperialist war and following it. The principal reason for this was explained many times by Marx and Engels between the years 1852 and 1892, from the example of Britain. That country's exclusive position led to the emergence, from the masses, of a semi-petty bourgeois, opportunist labor aristocracy. The leaders of this labor aristocracy were constantly going over to the bourgeoisie, and were directly or indirectly on its payroll. Marx earned the honor of incurring the hatred of these disreputable persons by openly branding them as traitors. Present-day, 20th century, imperialism has given a few advanced countries an exceptionally privileged position, which, everywhere in the Second International, has produced a certain type of traitor, opportunist, and social chauvinist leaders, who champion the interests of their own craft, their own section of the labor aristocracy. The opportunist parties have become separated from the masses, that is, from the broadest strata of the working people, their majority, the lowest paid workers. The revolutionary proletariat cannot be victorious unless this evil is combated, unless the opportunist, social traitor leaders are exposed, discredited and expelled. That is the policy the Third International has embarked on. To go so far, in this connection, as to contrast, in general, the dictatorship of the masses with the dictatorship of the leaders is ridiculously absurd, and stupid. What is particularly amusing is that, in fact, instead of the old leaders, who hold generally accepted views on simple matters, new leaders are brought forth, under cover of the slogan "Down with the leaders," who talk rank stuff and nonsense. Such are Laufenberg, Wilhelm, Horner, 18, Karl Schroeder, Friedrich Wendel, and Karl Oehler, 2 in Germany. Oehler's attempts to give the question more profundity and to proclaim that in general political parties are unnecessary and bourgeois are so supremely absurd that one can only shrug one's shoulders. It all goes to drive home the truth that a minor error can always assume monstrous proportions if it is persisted in, if profound justifications are sought for it, and if it is carried to its logical conclusion. Repudiation of the party principle and of party discipline, that is what the opposition has arrived at. And this is tantamount to completely disarming the proletariat in the interests of the bourgeoisie. It all adds up to that petty bourgeois diffuseness and instability, that incapacity for sustained effort, unity and organized action, which, if encouraged, must inevitably destroy any proletarian revolutionary movement. From the standpoint of communism, repudiation of the party principle means attempting to leap from the eve of capitalism's collapse, in Germany, not to the lower or the intermediate phase of communism, but to the higher. We in Russia, in the third year since the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, are making the first steps in the transition from capitalism to socialism or the lower stage of communism. Classes still remain, and will remain everywhere for years after the proletariat's conquest of power. Perhaps in Britain, where there is no peasantry, but where petty proprietors exist, this period may be shorter. The abolition of classes means, not merely ousting the landowners and the capitalists, that is something we accomplished with comparative ease. It also means abolishing the small commodity producers, and they cannot be ousted, or crushed. We must learn to live with them. They can, and must, be transformed and re-educated only by means of very prolonged, slow, and cautious organizational work. They surround the proletariat on every side with a petty bourgeois atmosphere, which permeates and corrupts the proletariat, and constantly causes among the proletariat relapses into petty bourgeois spinelessness, disunity, individualism, and alternating moods of exaltation and dejection. The strictest centralization and discipline are required within the political party of the proletariat in order to counteract this, in order that the organizational role of the proletariat, and that is its principal role, may be exercised correctly, successfully and victoriously. The dictatorship of the proletariat means a persistent struggle, bloody and bloodless, violent and peaceful, military and economic, educational and administrative, against the forces and traditions of the old society. The force of habit in millions and tens of millions is a most formidable force. Without a party of iron that has been tempered in the struggle, a party enjoying the confidence of all honest people in the class in question, a party capable of watching and influencing the mood of the masses, such a struggle cannot be waged successfully. It is 1,000 times easier to vanquish the centralized big bourgeoisie than to vanquish the millions upon millions of petty proprietors. However, through their ordinary, everyday, imperceptible, elusive and demoralizing activities, they produce the very results which the bourgeoisie need and which tend to restore the bourgeoisie. Whoever brings about even the slightest weakening of the iron discipline of the party of the proletariat, especially during its dictatorship, is actually aiding the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. Parallel with the question of the leaders, the party, the class, the masses, we must pose the question of the reactionary trade unions. But first I shall take the liberty of making a few concluding remarks based on the experience of our party. There have always been attacks on the dictatorship of leaders in our party. The first time I heard such attacks, I recall, was in 1895, when, officially, no party yet existed, but a central group was taking shape in St. Petersburg, which was to assume the leadership of the district groups. 20. At the 9th Congress of our party, April 1920-21, there was a small opposition, which also spoke against the dictatorship of leaders, against the oligarchy, and so on. There is therefore nothing surprising, new, or terrible in the infantile disorder of left-wing communism among the Germans. The ailment involves no danger, and after it the organism even becomes more robust. In our case, on the other hand, the rapid alternation of legal and illegal work, which made it necessary to keep the general staff, the leaders, under cover and cloak them in the greatest secrecy, sometimes gave rise to extremely dangerous consequences. The worst of these was that in 1912 the agent provocateur Malinovsky got into the Bolshevik Central Committee. He betrayed scores and scores of the best and most loyal comrades, caused them to be sentenced to penal servitude, and hastened the death of many of them. That he did not cause still greater harm was due to the correct balance between legal and illegal work. As member of the party's Central Committee and Duma deputy, Malinovsky was forced, in order to gain our confidence, to help us establish legal daily papers, which even under Tsarism were able to wage a struggle against the Menshevik opportunism and to spread the fundamentals of Bolshevism in a suitably disguised form. While, with one hand, Malinovsky sent scores and scores of the finest Bolsheviks to penal servitude and death, he was obliged, with the other, to assist in the education of scores and scores of thousands of new Bolsheviks through the medium of the legal press. Those German, and also British, American, French and Italian, comrades who are faced with the task of learning how to conduct revolutionary work within the reactionary trade unions would do well to give serious thought to this fact. 3. In many countries, including the most advanced, the bourgeoisie are undoubtedly sending agents provocateurs into the communist parties and will continue to do so. A skillful combining of illegal and legal work is one of the ways to combat this danger.